Hector never imagined that his life, carefully balanced between his studies and afternoons immersed in classic novels, would change so drastically. His mother had always been his refuge and companion in a simple life where routine was predictable and safe. When she met Fernando, a charismatic and lively man, Hector watched from afar as a special spark ignited in her. What started as sporadic dates soon became something serious, and before Hector could fully process it, his mother announced they were getting married. The day Fernando and Samuel arrived with their suitcases, Hector felt the atmosphere in his home shift. Fernando was pleasant, with a touch of formality in his demeanor, and he made an effort to include Hector in conversations and family activities. However, it was Samuel who seemed to stir the household dynamic the most. A year older than Hector, Samuel was everything Hector was not: extroverted, self-assured, and bursting with an almost overwhelming energy that filled every corner of the house. Samuel brought with him a large bag of sports equipment, a mountain bike, and a vibrant personality that contrasted with Hector's introspective nature. While Hector spent his afternoons at his small desk jotting down story ideas or absorbed in books, Samuel dedicated his time to training in the backyard, leaving a trail of sneakers and damp towels that Hector found irritating. The first days of living together were uncomfortable. Hector, used to silence and order, found that Samuel's presence disrupted the calm he so valued. Samuel had a loud laugh that echoed through the house and a habit of humming catchy tunes while cooking or cleaning. Hector tried to ignore him, but the more he tried, the more aware he became of Samuel's every move. Meals were a particular challenge. Fernando and Hector's mother made efforts to include both young men in conversations, but while Samuel enthusiastically recounted his sports exploits or school anecdotes, Hector remained a passive listener, only responding when directly addressed. For his part, Samuel seemed to notice Hector's silence and occasionally cracked jokes to break the ice, though these often left Hector blushing or staring down at his plate. The contrast between them became even more evident in the small details of daily life. Hector kept his desk meticulously organized, while Samuel seemed like a whirlwind, leaving books, shirts, and backpacks in his wake. But what unsettled Hector most wasn't the chaos Samuel brought, it was the way Samuel made him feel. There was something magnetic about how Samuel occupied his space, as if everything in the room revolved around him. His confidence was something Hector secretly envied, and his warm, genuine way of interacting with people sparked a mix of admiration and insecurity in Hector. One day, while Hector was reading in the living room, Samuel burst in with a basketball under his arm. "Are you always with a book?" Samuel asked with a teasing grin but no malice. Hector looked up, surprised by the interruption. "And are you always with something sporty?" he replied, trying to sound indifferent. Samuel laughed and flopped onto the couch, setting the basketball aside. "Touché. What are you reading?" Hector hesitated before answering. He wasn't used to anyone showing interest in his books. "It's an essay on contemporary narrative," he finally said. Samuel raised his eyebrows, impressed. "Wow, sounds complicated. I'm not much of a reader, but if you ever write something, let me know. I promise I'll read it." Hector didn't know what to say. It was the first time someone had shown such direct interest in his passion. While he tried to keep his expression neutral, a small spark of satisfaction lit up his face. Over time, Hector noticed that the initial clashes and awkward silences began to transform into something more bearable. Samuel, despite his clumsiness in maintaining order, made efforts not to invade Hector's space too much. And although Hector still felt unsettled by Samuel's presence, he also began to enjoy the casual conversations that arose between them. Little by little, Hector started to see Samuel beyond their differences. He noticed the dedication Samuel put into every training session, the respect with which he listened to Fernando, and the carefree yet kind way he treated Hector's mother. Without realizing it, Hector began to look forward to those moments when Samuel would ask him about his books or make a casual comment during dinner. Something was changing in the household dynamic, and while Hector couldn't pinpoint exactly what it was, he knew that Samuel was no longer just the stepson. This new beginning between them laid the groundwork for a relationship that, despite being full of contrasts, was starting to forge something deeper. Samuel brought with him an air of confidence that seemed to fill every corner of the house. From the very first day, his presence felt like a gust of fresh wind that disrupted the tranquil routine Hector had always known. With an easy smile, contagious laughter, and boundless energy, Samuel quickly won the favor of Fernando and Hector's mother. Fernando looked at him with pride, while Hector's mother seemed delighted by Samuel's warm and jovial way of integrating into the family. For Hector, however, Samuel's arrival was not as straightforward. There was something about him that sparked a whirlwind of emotions Hector struggled to process. The way Samuel naturally occupied space, as if he had always lived there, left Hector puzzled. He found himself watching Samuel more often than necessary, analyzing him as if trying to decipher a hidden code in his demeanor. The days following the move were a whirlwind of adjustments. While Samuel unpacked and organized his belongings, Hector tried to maintain a prudent distance. However, with their rooms now side by side, it was inevitable for them to frequently cross paths in the hallway or the kitchen. One night, as Hector poured himself a glass of water, Samuel walked into the kitchen wearing shorts and a sports t-shirt, his hair tousled from his workout. "Don't you ever sleep?" Samuel asked with a smile, opening the fridge to grab a drink. Hector shrugged. "I guess I enjoy the quiet of the night." Samuel nodded, pulling out a bottle of water and leaning casually against the counter. "I get it. Sometimes it's the only time of day when you can think clearly." The response caught Hector off guard. He hadn't expected to find common ground with Samuel, someone who seemed to live in a constant whirlwind of activity. For a moment, the atmosphere between them relaxed, but before Hector could say anything else, Samuel gave him a piercing look that left him speechless. "Why are you looking at me like that?" Samuel asked, breaking the silence with a mix of curiosity and amusement. Hector blushed and quickly averted his gaze. "I wasn't looking at you. I was just thinking." Samuel chuckled softly, a laugh that echoed through the small space and left Hector feeling even more nervous. "Sure, whatever you say," Samuel replied before leaving the kitchen, leaving Hector with a racing heart and more questions than answers. As the days turned into weeks, Hector began noticing things about Samuel that didn't fit the superficial image he had initially formed. Samuel wasn't just the outgoing and carefree guy who seemed to dominate every conversation, he was also someone who took his passions seriously. Hector watched him train in the backyard for hours, focused, with a determination that he hadn't expected from someone who appeared so laid back. One afternoon, as Hector read on the living room couch, Samuel walked in with a notebook and a thoughtful expression. "Do you mind if I sit here?" Samuel asked, gesturing to the other end of the couch. Hector shook his head, though the idea of sharing the space with Samuel made him nervous. "What are you working on?" he asked, more to fill the silence than out of genuine curiosity. Samuel held up the notebook and smiled. "I'm planning my training routine for a competition. It's complicated, but I like having a clear plan." Hector couldn't help but be impressed. He had always assumed Samuel improvised his way through life, but this revealed a more serious and organized side. "Sounds like a lot of work," Hector commented. "It is," Samuel admitted, "but when you love something, it doesn't feel like a sacrifice." Hector nodded, perfectly understanding that sentiment. That conversation, though brief, marked the beginning of a change. They started sharing small moments like this, talking about their interests and discovering that, despite their differences, they had more in common than they thought. As they spent more time together, Hector began to look forward to those shared moments. There was something about Samuel's casual yet genuine demeanor that made him feel comfortable, even as his presence unsettled him. However, Hector also realized that his unease wasn't just due to their differences. There was something more, something Hector wasn't ready to admit, even to himself. One afternoon, as Samuel helped Fernando with some house repairs, Hector watched from his bedroom window. With the sun shining on his face and a radiant smile, Samuel seemed to exude an energy that Hector found increasingly hard to ignore. He wondered if Samuel had any idea of the impact he was having on him, how his mere presence was starting to disrupt the carefully constructed balance of Hector's life. In those moments of introspection, Hector began to realize that what he felt for Samuel wasn't just admiration. There was something deeper, something that both terrified and fascinated him. Sharing the same roof, despite their differences, was creating a bond Hector couldn't ignore. Every interaction with Samuel brought him closer to a point where he would have to confront what he truly felt, not only about his stepfather's son but also about the new life they were building together. One evening, when Fernando and Hector's mother went out for a dinner date, the two young men found themselves alone in the house. The atmosphere felt different, quieter, almost charged with an unspoken tension. Samuel, lounging casually on the couch, glanced over at Hector as he walked past the living room with a book in hand. "Hey, want to watch something with me?" Samuel asked, his voice light and inviting. Hector hesitated, clutching his book tighter. He rarely spent extended time alone with Samuel, unsure of how to navigate their growing yet still fragile relationship. After a moment's pause, he nodded. "Sure, why not?" Samuel grinned and patted the empty spot on the couch beside him. The movie Samuel had chosen was a light-hearted comedy, filled with exaggerated characters and ridiculous situations. At first, Hector sat stiffly, unsure of how to act. But as the film unfolded, he found himself laughing at the absurd jokes, his initial discomfort fading. Samuel's laughter was infectious, deep and hearty, and Hector couldn't help but glance at him occasionally. The way Samuel threw his head back when something particularly funny happened made Hector smile. It was a side of him he hadn't fully seen before, unfiltered and genuinely happy. "Okay, this guy is ridiculous," Samuel said through his laughter, pointing at the screen. Hector chuckled. "I think that's the point. It's so over the top." The casual exchange grew into something more as the movie went on. During a quieter moment in the film, Samuel turned to Hector, a curious look on his face. "So, what's your thing?" he asked. "My thing?" Hector replied, confused. "Yeah, like what do you love to do? What gets you excited?" Samuel clarified, leaning slightly closer. Hector hesitated. His love for writing was something he rarely talked about, especially with someone as seemingly different from him as Samuel. But the openness in Samuel's gaze encouraged him. "I like to write," Hector admitted softly. "Stories, mostly. Fiction." Samuel's eyes lit up with genuine interest. "Seriously? That's cool. What kind of stories?" Hector felt a warmth rise to his cheeks. He wasn't used to people taking an interest in his passion. "Mostly short stories," he said. "About people and their lives. Sometimes I like imagining worlds that are completely different from ours." Samuel nodded thoughtfully. "That's awesome. You should show me sometime. I'd love to read one." The sincerity in Samuel's voice caught Hector off guard. He had always assumed Samuel wouldn't care about something as quiet and introspective as writing, but here he was, showing genuine curiosity. The conversation shifted, and for the first time, Samuel let his own guard down. He confessed that, despite his confident exterior, he often felt pressured to live up to the expectations his father had set for him. "Don't get me wrong, I love sports," Samuel said, twirling a strand of his hair absent-mindedly, "but sometimes it feels like I have to be this perfect athlete, you know? Like I can't mess up, or I'll disappoint him." Hector listened intently, surprised by the vulnerability in Samuel's tone. "I get that," he said. "It's hard when people expect so much from you. But I think it's okay to not be perfect all the time." Samuel looked at Hector, his expression softening. "Thanks," he said quietly. "I don't think anyone's ever told me that before." As the night progressed, Hector felt his initial nervousness melt away. For the first time, he saw Samuel as more than just the son of the stepfather. Samuel was a complex, layered person with fears and dreams of his own. By the time the movie ended, their conversation had moved far beyond the screen. They talked about their favorite books, childhood memories, and the kind of lives they wanted to lead. When the credits rolled, Samuel stretched and let out a content sigh. "That was fun," he said, turning to Hector with a grin. "We should do this more often." Hector smiled back, a quiet but genuine smile. "Yeah, we should." As they cleaned up the empty snack wrappers and turned off the TV, Hector couldn't help but feel like something had shifted between them. The walls he had carefully built around himself were starting to crack, and for the first time in a long time, he he didn't feel the need to rebuild them. That night, as Hector lay in bed, he replayed their conversation in his mind. He realized he no longer thought of Samuel as just the newcomer in his life. Samuel had become someone he could talk to, someone who understood him in a way he hadn't expected. Little did Hector know, Samuel was lying awake in his own room, thinking the exact same thing. The weekend arrived like an unexpected pause in the family routine. Fernando and Hector's mother prepared for their trip to the family event, leaving instructions about what needed to be done and asking both boys to behave. Hector noticed a special glint in Samuel's eyes as they waved goodbye at the door. Although Samuel was usually laid back, there was something different about his energy that day. Once they were alone, the house felt bigger and quieter than usual. Hector tried to focus on reading in his room, but the sound of music coming from the kitchen caught his attention. When he went downstairs, he found Samuel preparing an improvised dinner. "I hope you like pasta, because I'm not exactly creative in the kitchen," Samuel said, stirring a pot of sauce. Hector smiled, surprised by the gesture. "I do. I didn't expect you to cook." Samuel chuckled softly. "This is my attempt at being a good housemate. Besides, I don't think we've ever had a meal, just the two of us." The dinner was simple but delicious. They ate at the dining table, lit only by the kitchen lamp. The conversation flowed with an ease Hector hadn't experienced before. They talked about everything: books, music, childhood dreams, and the differences between their personalities. Hector was surprised to discover that Samuel had an introspective side, hidden beneath his confident exterior. An unexpected invitation. After dinner, Samuel suggested going out to the garden to look at the stars. Hector hesitated for a moment but accepted, intrigued by the idea. The night air was cool, and the clear sky revealed a sea of stars. They sat on the grass, wrapped in the tranquility of the night. Samuel lay back with his hands behind his head, gazing at the sky. "I've always loved this. It's like a reminder of how small we are, but at the same time, how big life can be." Hector, sitting cross-legged, watched him with curiosity. "I never imagined you being so reflective." Samuel smirked without looking away from the stars. "I don't usually show it. I've always felt like I have to be the strong one, the one who makes people laugh or meets everyone's expectations." Hector stared at him, noticing a vulnerability in Samuel he hadn't seen before. "I understand. I also hide what I really think or feel. It's easier if no one notices." The conversation continued in a more intimate tone. Samuel shared stories from his childhood, about how he always felt pressured to excel and impress his father. In return, Hector spoke about how he had found a refuge in books for his inner world. There was a comfortable silence between them, broken only by the sound of crickets. Samuel turned his head toward Hector. "I've never talked like this with anyone, especially someone I've just met. With you, it's different." Hector felt a knot in his stomach. There was something in the way Samuel looked at him, something that made his heart race. Without fully understanding why, he replied, "I don't usually talk like this either. With you, it's different too." The night wore on as they continued talking and sharing quiet moments. When they finally decided to go back inside, Hector felt lighter, as though he had let go of a weight he hadn't realized he was carrying. That night, lying in his bed, Hector couldn't stop thinking about Samuel. There was something magnetic about him, something that was beginning to break through the walls Hector had built around himself. Though he couldn't name it yet, he knew that night had marked the start of something significant. This weekend, which had started as a simple absence of adults, was turning into a turning point for both young men. The connection they had begun to forge was deepening with every shared moment, and Hector couldn't help but wonder what would come next. The moment of greatest intensity arrived on the second day, as they played video games in the living room. The afternoon light streamed through the curtains, bathing the space in a warm glow. The sound of buttons being pressed and the occasional laughter filled the air. It was easy, natural. During a break, as Samuel put down his controller and leaned back against the couch, his tone shifted. His usual carefree demeanor gave way to something more introspective. Hector, he began, his voice quieter than usual. Sometimes I feel like this house is the first place I've truly been able to breathe. I don't have to pretend as much here. With you, it's different. Hector froze. The words hit him like a wave, bringing with them a mix of emotions he couldn't quite name. His heart raced, and he struggled to find the right response. Finally, with a voice barely above a whisper, he replied, "I feel different when you're around too." The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable, it was charged with meaning. The game on the screen continued its background music, but neither of them seemed to notice. Samuel turned his head, his eyes searching Hector's for something unspoken. "You mean that?" Samuel asked softly, his expression both hopeful and vulnerable. Hector nodded, feeling his cheeks warm under Samuel's gaze. "Yeah, I do. I didn't know how to say it." Samuel let out a quiet laugh, running a hand through his hair. "I thought I was the only one feeling this way. I didn't want to mess things up. With us living under the same roof and everything." Hector's lips curled into a shy smile. "I get it. I'd been scared too. But it feels good to talk about it." Samuel shifted closer, the small space between them on the couch suddenly feeling like too much. "I guess I've been waiting for the right moment. But maybe there's no such thing as the right moment, huh?" Hector chuckled nervously. "Maybe this is it." Their laughter faded, replaced by the sound of their breaths mingling in the stillness of the room. Samuel reached out hesitantly, his hand brushing against Hector's. It was a light touch, almost imperceptible, but it sent a spark through both of them. "Can I?" Samuel started, his voice barely audible. Hector nodded, his pulse quickening. Samuel's hand settled over Hector's, his thumb tracing small, reassuring circles. The gesture was simple, yet it carried a weight that spoke volumes. "I don't know what this means for us," Samuel admitted, his voice low and sincere. "But I want to figure it out with you." Hector looked at him, his own fears melting away in the warmth of Samuel's words. "Me too," he said, his voice steady this time. The connection between them felt fragile yet undeniable, like something precious they both wanted to protect. They stayed there for a while, side by side, hands entwined, as the game continued to play on the screen, forgotten. This confession wasn't just a moment of honesty, it was a turning point, a step toward something neither of them had expected but both were eager to explore. The rest of the weekend passed like a quiet symphony, every moment between Hector and Samuel carrying an unspoken significance. They spent hours talking, laughing, and rediscovering small joys that felt amplified in each other's presence. The air seemed lighter, filled with an energy that neither could fully articulate, but both understood implicitly. On their last night alone, they sat together on the couch, a movie playing softly in the background. Neither of them was paying much attention to the screen. Samuel leaned back, his arm draped casually over the backrest, while Hector sat close, the warmth of their proximity creating an electric tension. Samuel turned to Hector, his expression softer than usual, his eyes filled with a mixture of nervousness and certainty. "I'm glad we had this time together," he said, his voice low. "I didn't know it could feel this easy, being myself." Hector met his gaze, his heart racing. "Me too," he replied, barely above a whisper. "You make it feel safe." A quiet moment stretched between them, the only sound the faint dialogue from the movie. Samuel reached out hesitantly, brushing a strand of hair from Hector's forehead, his fingers lingering just a second longer than necessary. Hector closed his eyes briefly at the touch, his chest tightening with emotions he had only begun to understand. "Can I tell you something?" Samuel asked, his hand dropping to the space between them. Hector nodded, his breath catching. "I've never felt this way about anyone," Samuel admitted, his voice trembling slightly. "And I don't know where it's going, but I don't want it to stop." Hector's cheeks flushed, his vulnerability mirroring Samuel's. "I've felt it too," he confessed. "And I don't want it to stop either." The silence that followed wasn't heavy but full of possibility. Slowly, Samuel closed the distance between them, his forehead resting lightly against Hector's. For a moment, they simply sat like that, eyes closed, their breaths mingling, the world outside fading into insignificance. When their lips met, it was tentative, a gentle exploration that spoke of trust and shared longing. The kiss deepened gradually, a blend of sweetness and unspoken promises, each movement affirming the connection they had been afraid to acknowledge. As they pulled apart, their eyes met, and both broke into quiet, almost disbelieving laughter, the kind that comes from relief and joy intertwined. "We'll figure this out," Samuel said softly, his thumb brushing against Hector's cheek. "Together," Hector replied, a shy but determined smile lighting up his face. When Fernando and Hector's mother returned the following afternoon, the two boys had settled into a rhythm that felt unforced, natural. They didn't rush to define what they were, but the foundation had been laid, a bond forged through honesty and vulnerability. As the days turned into weeks, they continued to share moments of quiet companionship and mutual understanding, trusting that the path they were on would unfold in its own time. It wasn't just a new chapter for Hector and Samuel, it was a beginning filled with hope, possibility, and the quiet courage to embrace something extraordinary.